research in social sciences, and we have lots of speakers like Professor Rajiv Bhargav, who is contributed his valuable thought on political theory, how to do research in political theory, and also various other scholars like Professor Nandini Sundar from Delhi School of Economics, and also Professor Kancha Ilaiha, and also the Professor Satish Deshpande, who have contributed their valuable thought on research, particularly. And today's talk is on the title Theorizing Caste, experience as a method of inquiry. The title of this today's talk is that. So when we talk about the questions of caste and the particularly theorization of caste, then always there is the debate come into the mind, how to do research, particularly the caste, how to theorize the questions of caste. In this context, there is lots of debates also going on today's academia, like Professor Gopal Guru's and Sundar Sarukai's book, Cracked Mirror, which reveals many kinds of questions to the theorization of caste, the ethics of theorization of caste, and the authenticity and identity, and phenomenology, particularly the methods. Some extent we are known about the methods of phenomenology, but today's talk is basically aims at to engage all this debate, how to theorize the questions of caste, and this debate basically in Indian context, the question of caste is much more theorized in the literary and the aesthetics fields particularly, but we are not that much able to engage the questions of caste, particularly the experience questions, into the discourse of social science research. So in these debates, the question of identity come, and therefore in the questions of identity, when we look that Professor Gopal Guru always allays to the much more theorizing the question of caste in aesthetics field, but it is unable to engage in the social science, and alleges, I am quoting his one phrase, that particularly Dalits are trying to compensate for theoretical deficiency by producing brilliant poetry. And also in the cinematic studies, we always engage these debates into the aesthetics and artistic field when we theorizing the questions of caste. And the social science always, these social scientists are trying to allegate that social science is unable to engage the questions of caste particularly. So and to answer all these questions, how to theorize caste, and how these aesthetic terms, particularly in these days, some scholars like Sudipta Kaviraj started to argue aesthetic. We need to understand the phenomenon like political phenomenon and other kind of social phenomenon. We need to understand the aesthetics field also. And for this conjunction between the aesthetics and the subject of political and subject of social is, I think, it is the more pertinent to understand from Professor Soumyabrata Choudhury, particularly because his scholarship on this field, particularly the subject of political and the subject of art and aesthetics, he is much more brilliantly in his writings engaged in this aspect. And I would like to introduce Professor Soumyabrata Choudhury first of all. Professor Soumyabrata Choudhury is a professor at this Center for Arts and Aesthetics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He is a distinguished philosopher also, and whose writings always reflects the idea of aesthetics and arts into the questions of political and legal, all these aspects. Particularly, he draws his ideas from the ancient Greek philosopher like Aristotle, and compare it with the questions of Indian traditions also. And he has Professor Choudhury has been contributed extensive work on the academics, particularly in the humanities and social sciences. The most important book of his contribution is that theater, number, event, three studies on the relationship between sovereignty, power, and truth, which has been published in 2013. And the another book is Ambedkar and Other Immortals, an Untouchable research program, which has been published in 2018. And recently, one of his book has been published that now it's come to distances, notes on Sahinbag and coronavirus, association and isolation. So I think this is the time to I over to you, Professor Choudhury, for today's talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ganesh. Can I ask you for how long am I meant to speak broadly?
About to 30 to 40 minutes, I think. Yes,
That's
Vidyasagar?
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll speak for around 40 minutes. All right.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So thank you, Vidyasagar, Ganesh, and everyone else for this very kind invitation to speak on this occasion at this forum, which seems to be doing extraordinarily interesting work with regard to social science research, particularly with young scholars. And I'm very happy to talk to all of you. And today's theme is equally interesting and difficult, of course. The question of experience as a category of research, but also as a method of inquiry, with specific pertinence to caste in social science. So, of course, the first point that one will have to make is that experience does not seem to be, in a very classical sense or in a very expected sense, to be an academic category. Experience seems to be a more wide-ranging, even public category. It belongs to the most common domain of human life. Insofar as we all human beings are all capable and also susceptible to experiencing the world in different ways. To that extent, it's far wider and non-specialized than what an academic space usually connotes. In an academic space, we usually engaged with specialized knowledge, while the term experience seems to indicate something far more wide-ranging, common, public. In that sense, you could even say more universal. Insofar as we are human beings in some, real living sense, all of us are subjects of experience. We all have experiences, or we all experience something or the other. To that extent, experience as a category seems to be concerned with some sort of a fundamental capacity of the human animal, insofar as such an animal is also understood to be conscious. So experience seems to, in much of what has been written about it, particularly in the domain of philosophy, seems to be something to do with what unfolds for us in our encounter with the world, in our life in the world, and what unfolds for us individually in the world also, in a sense, is reflected by us in terms of our own capacity to partly, at least partly, not entirely, but partly grasp what is happening to us. And that is what is called by being conscious. A consciousness as something which, in a sense, becomes the correlate, becomes the faculty or the inner space, the interiority to which experience apparently belongs. And that is something which is not a matter of a privilege, or it is not a matter of right or prerogative on any particular kind of human being or any particular community or class of human beings. But at least basically, fundamentally, we seem to understand that such a consciousness is universal. All human beings seem to possess the possibility of such a consciousness. This seems to be the large presumption or the large understanding, common sense understanding that comes with the word experience. And because we're talking about social science research and research methodology, we have to remember that in much of what was constituted to be the field of the knowledges of the social world, what were also called in the 19th century the great disciplines of, for instance, political economy or sociology or anthropology. In each of these pursuits of knowledge, what seemed to be the real object of interest was something like a totality or a structure that you could call, for instance, in anthropology, the totality that you called the space of human civilization or human society in a fundamental sense of what constitutes the being of the human being as a cultural being, or sociology itself as all of society as a totality. A society would be understood as some sort of a structure, some sort of a totality that could be constituted as an object of knowledge. Now, of course, in all of these inquiries in the 19th century and the formation of the great disciplines, there was a lot of individual empirical research, no doubt. There were ethnographic inquiries that were taking place, particularly in the colonial context, when the colonizing scholars were entering into colonized societies and doing immense amount of ethnographic data collection and sifting of data about new unknown societies, unfamiliar societies. That was happening, no doubt. At the same time, the main question of knowledge or science was not really the experience of the ethnographer. It was not really the experience of the scientist. It was not really the experience of the researcher as he or she entered into the field of the different kinds of social phenomena. The real question was knowledge as such, knowledge of the totality. So you would ask this question, which is, of course, a very Orientalist question from the 19th century, but what is the essential characteristic or set of characteristics that could describe an X society, whether it's an Indian society or an African society, from the point of view of a non-Western, a non-Eastern, non-Oriental scholar, which again seemed to want to get at something like a structural truth, structural essence, which could be more or less compressed within a set of essential characteristics. So there was a paradox involved there. In the 19th century, with the formation of the great disciplines, on the one hand, there was a search for an objective scientific method, which wanted to be able to home in on certain structural characteristics which could be objectively mapped. So anthropologists would want to actually describe empirically all the specific features of a non-Western society in terms, for instance, of its ritual character, of its social customs, and every other kind of everyday existence. In that sense, yes, it would want to enter the experience of these non-Western new societies. And we have so many stories and narratives of great anthropologists who are as much brilliant and fabulous storytellers, narrators. But at the same time, the main stakes, the main interest in all of these projects remained to be able to get at, through these objective characterizations of society, something like an essence, something which could be in some fundamental sense, be differentiated, if not opposed, to the societies from where these scholars came, which is Western society. So, in that sense, indeed, the question of experience has to be seen in the 19th century context in two ways. The first way is to be able to find the objective structural markers, objective structural indices that could be scientifically analyzed about an experience which is alien, which is other, whether that be a particular society or a culture or even a set of individual customs and rituals. So, in that sense, to be able to enter into an alien experience, but objectively, to find a certain set of objective, analyzable elements and their combinations. This was the scientific project. But yes, at the same time, there was the second aspect. And the second aspect was that the ethnographer herself or himself, the anthropologist, the scientist, the explorer, the conqueror, each of these figures would also constitute a domain of their own experience, which also became at that time a kind of subterranean but a very powerful current, what could be called the literary or the aesthetic underside of the great social scientific projects that were formed in the 19th century, great disciplinary projects of the 19th century. And this underside was actually self-reflexive. Because here, we were not talking only of the experience of the non-Western subject, but we are talking about the experience of this particular figure of the researcher herself or himself. How does a researcher who comes to an alien society come to terms with the experience of this alienness itself? Does he or she do it with an attitude which is one of a certain kind of domination? Or does he or she do it in a spirit of what could be called universal equality? This gave rise to a new dimension in otherwise disciplinary academic projects. And this was a dimension of ethics. Now, at an individual level, it was a question of ethics. That does the great Western researcher, the man of knowledge, want to dominate the alien system of knowledge, the system of society, through knowledge, through constituting a kind of objectivized, at the same time orientalized knowledge, which then contributes to a project of colonial domination, which could also, of course, be called, in a certain idiom, though I don't like using that vocabulary, could be called a philosophical domination, the Enlightenment domination of the Western sort, and so on and so forth. This could be one way to go. At the individual level, it would be a project which would be one of mastery, and at a political level, it would be a project which would be obviously a colonizing project, a sovereignist project. But if you think of it from the other angle, that is it possible to enter into this domain of experience of the other with an attitude that is an ethical attitude at the individual level, at the level of the individual researcher, who in some senses brings a certain assumption or a certain axiom or premise of equality, equality within otherness, equality within difference. And if we can envisage or imagine, even minimally, such an ethical attitude on part of the researcher, then can this particular ethical attitude translate into a new kind of egalitarian politics within the sphere of academic research? And how would such an academic politics contribute to the larger politics of emancipation from colonialism, both from the side of the colonized as well as the colonizer? This is a context of what you have yourself chosen as a sphere of social science research in its deeper, disciplinary historical constitution. But if you now bring this deeper but large context, disciplinary context, to the specific question of caste, then it of course gives rise to a whole set of very particular difficulties that will also of course offer very interesting new methods of inquiring, new ways of inquiring. So let me briefly mention some of these difficulties and possibilities. And let me do it through the eminently singular and unique example of Dr. Ambedkar, who actually is placed in that exact cusp that we are talking about in the sphere of anthropology. When he goes to Columbia, in the middle of the 1910 to 20 decade, and studies anthropology in the US as part of a certain kind of academic environment which actually practices both these things that I mentioned, a certain objectivist scientific constitution of knowledge, and at the same time a problematic relationship with the experience of other societies, alien societies, where the problem has to be either dealt with ethically, or it has to be, it has to be, it has to become the tool of a certain project of colonial mastery and political domination. It is exactly in this kind of an ambiguous context that a person goes to Columbia from an untouchable caste, the Mahar caste, which actually has an effect which is completely different from the general effect that you would imagine with a relatively newly educated first generation or second generation educated person coming from India, going to the West and studying and inserting himself or herself in the studies of the great disciplines, one of which is anthropology. But with Ambedkar, with Baba Saheb, the significance is, as you all realize, is markedly, significantly different. No? Why? Because the person who goes to Columbia in this case is not an average upper caste Indian with already a certain kind of cultural capital, a certain kind of educational background, even if that educational background is steeped in Brahmanical upper caste education. Here is a person who goes to pursue the great social science project of discipline, of objectivity, from a class of Indian society which is radically excluded from any such possibility, even within the Brahmanical apparatus of knowledge. In fact, the impact of the significance becomes that much more polarized because when Ambedkar goes to Columbia to study anthropology, and of course he also studied associated disciplines like economics and so on and so forth, law, all of those great disciplines, he does it with a clean slate. In that sense, does not do it out of the Orientalist schema at all, which is a schema of comparison between something like Indic knowledge and what the Westerners were bringing in as liberal knowledge. This comparative schema of Indic knowledge as comparable to liberal knowledge, which is also favorite with a lot of our scholars today, does not really at that moment concern Ambedkar. It is a different matter that over the next 40 years of his life, Ambedkar will create a tremendously powerful comparative system, which is a comparative system addressing culture, politics, society, and eventually something like change, what Ambedkar called change. But he will do it, and this is my point, he will do it not out of the attraction, the discursive and intellectual attraction of the great encyclopedia of knowledges that brings together in the Orientalist world the knowledges of the East and the West, which was a favorite, as you all know, from, the great Max Muller and other Western scholars to their Indic counterparts, that there is a great web of knowledges that becomes world knowledge, the encyclopedia of global knowledge. From the old Sanskritic Orientalist past, comparable to the Latins and the Persians and the Nordics, to the present, where in a sense Western liberal education preserves and extends that great golden past, while the colonized societies have declined, but with the promise that their golden days can come back, which of course translates into a great revivalist religious project also, which the Orientalists encouraged. Ambedkar is not concerned with any of this. At the same time, he will use these very elements of knowledges, the different genealogies of knowledge and the different effects of knowledge from all over the world, whether Indic, Western, and a lot of things in between, to produce a different kind of comparative thinking, which is a comparative thinking not to consolidate knowledge, but to break knowledge into that part which is reactionary and oppressive, and produce a new knowledge, which is a knowledge which is revolutionary and emancipatory. But that is, of course, something which brings the entire gamut of Ambedkar's work into the picture, and that is not really what we are concerned with today, or we can't even do that sort of study or that sort of discussion in a brief period like this. But what I'm saying is, in the first period of his life, when he goes to Columbia, he already has a distance from the stakes of both Brahmanical and Orientalist research programs, what I, in my own vocabulary, call research programs, to constitute already a new kind of research program. What is that research program? What is the difficulty of that research program? And what is the possibility of that research program? With the example of Ambedkar, let us quickly take a look at these two things. Now, in Columbia, when he makes his great seminar presentation called Castes in India, Genesis, Transmission, and so on and so forth of caste in Indian society, what you will find in that elegant presentation is that Ambedkar, on the one hand, absolutely takes all the disciplinary literature that exists on caste at that time, coming both from Indian scholars but also from non-Indian scholars. For instance, a French scholar, Senard, and other scholars, into account as part of his literature discussion on caste. That he does. But often, when he makes a specific intervention of his own and produces a singular thesis, that is a new Ambedkarite thesis or a new thesis from his own side, then he argues it on both bases. One is the hypothesis as it is supported by a certain kind of evidence that he offers in support of his hypothesis on the origin, the genesis of caste and its transmission, but also on the grounds of something very singular to him, which is his own experience with caste. And this is a very interesting bifurcation within the Ambedkarite discourse so early on. That neither is Ambedkar someone who could be immediately clubbed or classified into what through Gopal Guru, Ganesh has called the aesthetic or the literary sort of the literary way of producing a discourse on the experience of caste. Ambedkar cannot be classified as someone who exclusively belongs to this aesthetic or literary part of discourse. At the same time, Ambedkar cannot also be fixed into a kind of scholarly image of someone who produces merely objective thesis and objective analyses of caste. So what is interesting in Ambedkar is a kind of bifurcation which takes place in very subtle ways. When he both undertakes the rigorous research of what could be called the method of science as in social science in this case, but at the same time, in certain critical tactical moments, he also produces a certain discourse, which is not an autobiographical discourse necessarily, but a discourse which is a discourse on experience or a discourse of experience. So if you compare his literally autobiographical writings, for instance, in Waiting for a Visa, when he goes back to his childhood and the kinds of experiences of untouchability that he and his family members experienced when, for instance, traveling on the road to where his father was stationed and so on and so forth, then it is not something which emerges as an isolated description, isolated narration from where he actually understands these experiences as belonging to a specific kind of caste relation, which in Annihilation of Caste, very, very lucidly and pointedly, Ambedkar calls a wrong relation. So this is something I would like to highlight. That Ambedkar, in his own analysis as well as his own narrations, his own testimonies, is eventually saying something very paradoxical. He's saying caste is an experience of a wrong relation on all sides, from all sides. Because caste is fundamentally a wrong relation. Caste is not only experience. Caste is experienced, but it is experienced in a certain objective domain, which is also then accessible to the constitution of analysis and knowledge. But what is accessible to the analysis of knowledge is not something objective in the sense of something neutral, but already there is something there which carries a certain negativity, a certain kind of scourge, a certain anathema, which Ambedkar simply calls wrongness, the wrongness of the relation that is caste. So how does one constitute a knowledge of wrongness, but which is an objective wrongness insofar as it is encoded or codified in the caste relation? Because caste is a relation. So that's why Ambedkar in the text, Castes in India, will again and again say that caste is always multiple. But at the same time, it is not multiple in the sense of multiple isolated units. Caste is multiple in the sense of a relationship which makes this multiplicity into a system. So that's why he puts caste into plural. He says caste is a system of castes. But at the same time, the system of castes is not a neutral objective reality which can only be described or analyzed, and in that sense studied in a purely scientific, disciplinary spirit. This wrongness of relation must also be something which becomes an object of intervention. So this is the delicate cusp, or that sort of, point of contact between a scientific research project and a politico-ethical project of intervention and change. And the first job is not to make that change, because that anyway cannot come from purely academic work. But the first job is to be aware of that particular contradiction, that particular negativity, that particular anathema that the study of caste carries. You see, this is very important in the present context. This Ambedkarite rigor, which is not an objectivist rigor merely, but it is a rigor which is necessary to the further larger collective political project of changing society. Because Ambedkar's first lesson to us is not an ethical lesson. It is indeed a scholarly lesson. And the scholarly lesson is that you must be able to confront the wrong relation of caste in all its material practice. In that sense, to put it very concretely, you must be able to name caste. For instance, if you were to take off the question of untouchability at that time, then in another text from 1936, which is called Away from the Hindus, Ambedkar will speak of the name untouchable and the names of the different untouchable jatis already. holding in itself this anathema, this unbearable scourge, this curse that caste is for the untouchable as something experienced only by the untouchable, which no one else can experience. That is singular. But at the same time, it is not singular in the isolationist sense. It is singular in the relational sense. That while it is a relationship between the dominant caste and the untouchable caste, one part of this relationship can only be experienced uniquely by the dominated, which the dominant caste cannot experience. And yet, the experience would not be possible without the existence of the dominant class in that particular constitution of the wrong relation that caste is. So the first lesson is indeed scientific and empirical, even in the materialist sense, that one must be able to confront this particular asymmetry, even this violence, in all of its reality. One must not disavow it. One must not say, oh, this does not exist. Oh, let's not talk about it. Oh, it might exist as an exception, in some sort of exceptional bad cases. But in the normative society, everything is okay. Now, this is a major symptom and a major problem with us in our present modern day disposition towards the question of caste. Whether the reason for that is political or it is something which belongs to a certain turn of contemporary media modernity, that is a different discussion I don't want to get into. But as a specific symptom or as a specific problem, it is indeed a problem that exists for us. That the first rigorous step of caste as a real ensemble of names and the violent, obscene effects of the names of the different kinds of castes is something we would like to avoid or disavow, or or at least put into euphemisms. So that's why the question of caste census raises such a polarized reaction. That, oh, let's not use caste census to, in a sense, exacerbate caste, to intensify caste, or from the other side, let caste census be the new grounds for a new set of policy measures. So this is the first moment in the Ambedkarite method of thinking about caste research, that you have to, in that sense, treat caste empirically in the real world. But at the same time, you must not treat it empirically in the sense of the dispassionate scientific observer who, in that sense, collects data or quantifies data and produces a certain kind of statistical picture of reality. In that sense, Ambedkar was really emphatic that the experience of caste must be constituted as a totality, not simply as something which is from the side of one end of the relationship or the other, but as a totality. How does one do it? This is the real challenge that Ambedkar confronts us with or places in front of us with regard to caste. How is it possible to produce an understanding of caste which is a wrong relation as a totality when on both ends of the experience, whether the dominated or the dominant, there is already in the very nature of that experience a certain non-commensurability, a certain gap, a certain break. The Brahmin or the Brahmanical caste oppressor cannot enter the world, the life world, in phenomenological terms, of the untouchable. And the untouchable cannot obviously, get into the shoes of the oppressor. So isn't there, in constituting a totality, an understanding of the totality of the wrong relation that caste is, a certain difficulty at the level of pure empirical social science research of caste? So the question has to be posed in all its seriousness and all its complexity. And Ambedkar posed it all his life. But of course, Ambedkar had a response to that very question which is a great response, the greater response that academics is often a little nervous about, a little, anxious about, which is a political response. So that's why Ambedkar, in that sense, he was very close to the great revolutionary projects of the 19th to 20th centuries, which broke the university space of the university and its highly elitist character, whether in Europe or in India and in other colonized societies, broke that space and spoke of a larger public political project of changing society through new forms of organization, new forms of militancy, and eventually new forms of the capture of the state, including the liberal bourgeoisie state, the Brahmanical state in the Indian context. So when we came to the question of actually breaking out of the wrong relation that caste is, then there is indeed a shift of levels. And that shift of level is political. And it concerns the larger public intellectuality of the people rather than the specialized preoccupations of the researcher and the scholar. But we must not forget that this greater step to the public, the space of public thinking, public consciousness, is only possible when we start with the phenomenological as well as scientific rigor of both empirically encountering and describing the material reality of caste, as well as structurally encoding the different elements of caste in a language that is not partisan, but scientific and objective and transmissible as a kind of integral transmission of the knowledge of caste as part of social science research. It is exactly with this kind of opening up of the great space of understanding caste, both in the sense of an objective reality, but also in the sense of this politico-ethical challenge, that contemporary research in caste has both renewed its interest in these questions, but also come up with new kinds of impasses. Now, I don't know how much time I have because this is a large mandate to talk about these things, but maybe I'll take 10 minutes more. Is that all right,
Yes.
Vidyasagar? Ganesh? Yeah,
Yes,
10
yes.
minutes.
You can. You can.
So in contemporary research, and Gopal Guru is a great pioneer in this project. You see, we have a different kind of situation today, from the 19th century to the early 20th century cusp that I spoke of, with example of Ambedkar in mind. Now, with Ambedkar, you do see his exceptional status, both from within the untouchable castes, which was deprived from education in any case, and which was subject to the most inhuman exclusions and oppressions, but also he's an exception in the sense of the larger idea of education in India, which was highly Brahmanical and dogmatic, even with its great, geniuses and its great scholars. Who can doubt that? But as a research program, as a field of knowledge, the dominant Brahmanical space of Hindu knowledge, or the Hindu system of a certain kind of a knowledge protocol, a research protocol, was indeed dominated by, if not in the biblical or the Quranic sense of a single book being the source of dogma, not really that, indeed not that. But interestingly, with the Orientalist intervention, and you'll see this in Savarkar, you'll see this influence in Savarkar, one should read Savarkar very carefully, you'll see this influence in Savarkar, that with the Orientalist influence, the paradigm of the great monotheistic books, the religion of the books, does play a paradigmatic role, a decisive role in reimagining or repositioning the rather scattered and disorganized corpus of Hindu of Hindu texts that had been inherited till then, till the 19th century moment and early 20th century. There is a certain desire of monotheistic reorganization and orientalizing monotheistic reorganization, which is, I think, definitely at the basis of the Hindu Mahasabha to the RSS structure. So in that sense, there is a desire to create a particular kind of hierarchy between dogma and experience. So the religion also becomes a really important reference point when we speak of experience, Because after all, what is the greatness of talking about experience? I started out with that point. It is something which is entirely materialistic. Experience is something which arises out of the autonomous encounter of the human being into the world or in the world. Now, of course, autonomy leads to otherness. So in that sense, there is no pure autonomy. I always use the term auto-heteronomy or a hetero-autonomy. Because in the very constitution of our autonomous selves in the world, there is the worldness of the world, which is other. But this very auto-heteronomy or auto-heterogeneity was the precise opening onto something which was egalitarian, materialist, and universal, because it is a capacity which unites and at the same time differentiates all human beings from different countries, different races, different genders, different languages, and so on and so forth. But one of the great governments of this kind of open egalitarian heterogeneity was the dogma of religion. And monotheistic religions provided a paradigm for this kind of dogmatic government, where the great text of the monotheistic religion could, in a sense, prescribe experience, not simply record experience or tell beautiful stories, which, for instance, the Old Testament contains some of the most beautiful stories, or even the Hindu texts contain some of the most beautiful stories, no doubt. But all of that would still produce a certain prescriptive attitude towards experience, towards the fundamental heterogeneity and autonomy of human experience. So religion is a major reference point as something which wants to control experience, not oppose experience, but control it, govern it, and sometimes even appropriate it, use it. You see, Ambedkar's own position at that moment was exceptional, and Phule already is a pioneer. He's a forerunner to Ambedkar, because he breaks with that kind of both the monotheistic religious sort of a prescription of experience through the great book. At the same time, he also breaks out of the fundamental deprivation of the everyday access to education that upper caste Hindus had, deprived the untouchables of at that time, and even up to this point, from people from erstwhile untouchable castes in the higher education, as you know, at the most belong to second generation educated families, and some of them are still part of the first generation experience of education. So that is a continuing inheritance of that deprivation. Ambedkar actually breaks out of both these moments. But today what we find, even with a great lag in the history of education for the lower castes, and particularly for the erstwhile untouchable castes, what we do find is, in the domain of the 20th century to the 21st, a whole series of great universalist egalitarian movements, though of very different kinds, to, in a sense, provide us with a new measure of experiences belonging to the capacities and the possibilities of the human being. What I mean is, the measures that are found, for instance, in the great revolutionary movements of the working classes from the 19th to the 20th century. The great political claims and assertions of the suffragette movement in the feminist movement, which actually becomes a pioneer of constitutional thinking on unconditional, unqualified equality of rights for men and women and every other gender when it comes to voting. And eventually, within the Dalit movement itself in India, the great possibility of thinking of the Dalit movement, and Gail Ombed points it out, and we must pay very close attention to this, not simply as a movement of, of equality, that is the equality of human beings as belonging to something like a fundamental axiomatic equality, but also the claims of an equal access to power, to state power, to that very source of control and government which till now has been usurped and appropriated and monopolized by the upper castes. Again, this is not the time to go into these details, but Gail Ombed pointed out that the Mandal Commission movement, in a sense, through the Shudra movement, through the backward caste movement, in a sense, told us that what the Dalits, from the Dalit Panther times at least, Ambedkar to Dalit Panther times, that sequence, had already initiated was not simply the larger anti-caste movement which aspired to equality, but something far more conjunctural and post-independent India's specific, its specific stakes of entering into state power and giving the Dalits, and through the Dalits, the possibility of other castes, other backward castes. Though, of course, because it's a zero-sum game, between the Dalits and the backward castes, there will be a game of power, no doubt about that. But still, the very opening onto this possibility was unthinkable till then, because it was entirely dominated by the Brahmanical majoritarian minority, basically. This opened up as a new kind of measure of thinking about equality, not just general equality, but equality in terms of power. All of this becomes the background for any social science research back into the academic space today. So when Gopal Guru makes his intervention, when today the young scholar from Presidency College, Presidency University, Roger Troy, makes his intervention and speaks of a Dalit truth today, when others make their intervention, they're not doing it in the same conjuncture that Ambedkar was placed at between the 19th and 20th centuries. Today, in the 21st century, 20th to 21st centuries, we already have a great range of measures of a certain opening up of experience, which is the feminist experience, that is the woman's experience, the Dalit experience, which is the experience of the untouchable caste transforming itself and themselves into a revolutionary class. So Dalit understood also as a revolutionary possibility. The LGBT movement as something which takes queerness as a radical style of otherness, yet wanting its universal place in the world, and so on and so forth. But you see, this might look like, in a sense, a kind of ideal opening up of heterogeneity and possibilities of new kinds of alliances of the different subaltern oppressed classes of society. But what it produces is a new complexity, new debate. That's why between Sharmila Rege and Gopal Guru, there was a discussion about the question of Dalit feminism and feminism in the more heterogeneous, across gender, across social strata sense. Is there a specific experience which would be called a woman's experience at the basis of feminist thinking, or is there a specific Dalit experience which needs to be articulated with a woman's experience to think of a Dalit feminism? Now, I'm not going to enter into the specific debates themselves, but what I am saying is that a background in the 21st century is today so richly set for us, not to simply solve all our problems, but to make those problems, in a sense, articulate themselves in new complex ways. So my point is that all these debates, as they're carrying on today, produce. So Gopal, for instance, Gopal Guru speaks of a continuous need to renew the ethical project within the academic world, and I completely accept his what he urges us to do. I follow him there. But at the same time, I think there are limits to the ethical prescription. And this is my last point. And this is my little response to someone I respect so much, individually, but also as a scholar, Gopal Guru. That on the one hand, it is his continuous enjoining, his urging us to keep the ethical moment that I already spoke of in the Ambedkarite context alive, where we are not just doing social science research in the objective scholarly sense, but are continuously alive and attuned to the ethico-political moment where a wrong relation remains wrong, and it must be ethically, in a sense, first of all, ethically responded to before it can be prescriptively or scientifically transformed, or transformed through policy, statist policy, whatever. But first of all, the scholar must be an ethically attuned person, attuned subject. This part of Gopal Guru's uh, teaching, I try to learn from. But I also have to say this, that this teaching is applicable in any meaningful sense only to the space of the university. The social science project, of which he is such a tremendous, an inspiring figure of a new kind of methodological possibility that he brings out, nevertheless returns us to the limits of the university. And it seems to me that within those limits, the ethics, in a sense, sometimes, not always, sometimes meets against a political impasse. And that political impasse is as clear as this, that on the one hand, the old upper caste Brahmanical hegemony over the educational capital, which in a sense combines liberal capital with Brahmanical capital, still holds sway in terms of determining the contours of the university space. And second, its complete stranglehold in the grasp of a reactionary Hindu upper caste communal statist administration, including in JNU, that completely wants to engineer education towards its very vicious ends, taken together, in a sense, produce a certain impasse in the university, which ethics itself cannot quite meet up with. Individual ethics to transpersonal ethics within small communities of scholars is not, I have to say this, able to contend with the challenge. It is too big, it is too deep, it is too dense. And to that extent, my own response to Gopal Guru and his teaching is that the university is desperate for a new politics. And not the university as an enclosed, localized space. The university as a site, as a strategic site, which opens up to exactly what Ambedkar was looking for, a new kind of public intellectuality, a new kind of people's thought, which has a site in the university, but is not exhausted by it. In this matter, it seems to me, the university has a very important role to play, and social science research has a very important ethical sort of trigger to provide, catalyst, a kind of catalyzing function it has. But it in itself cannot be a substitute for new collective politics. And there, I would end by saying that a kind of research program that I have found extremely rejuvenating and at the same time opening up the possibilities for a future, whether that future will arrive today, tomorrow, or not within many of our own lifetimes, I do not know, but still a future, is provided by the kind of politics association that a lot of new students' politics that has been initiated out of the relatively marginalized Dalit students' movements that have taken place, whether that be in the very universities that you mentioned, CUG, HCU, TIS, and other places, including a little bit in JNU, and something which, in a sense, brings up debates, which are debates of urgent and deep social science uh, relevance, social scientific relevance, but cannot always be uh, completely exhausted by the disciplinary name of the individual social sciences. So let me end with this. Thank you for your patience.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Soumyabrata Choudhury, for your refreshing talk on this idea of caste and experience. It is really a kind of eclectic research agenda in manifest the kind of social science research through the experience, how we can theorize the experience in social science research from starting from the uh, theoretical genealogies of this debate of experience to the Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, which is actually really a new insight for us, actually, I think, because we are getting in the dilemma to counter the many kind of binary which is exist in this time. And this is really a new epistemic idea to understand the experience. And we can refer the Ambedkar. And I think now the platform is open for the audience to ask the question to Professor Choudhury. If anyone, any kind of questions, then they can raise the question now. Hello. Now, this is the time of audience. They can ask questions. Anybody? I think, uh, yeah. Yes, Suman Talukdar. You can go.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, yes. You are audible. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an exciting lecture. So, as to term it, got to learn a new way of looking at social science research, and also looking at the ways we can incorporate experience into the way we look at society and understanding it in a new prism. I have a query of sorts which would want you to answer how, as somebody who's just beginning their research, would look at experience beyond um, an individual case study to something that we can transfer into academics or an academic research. For example, when does a particular experience stop becoming an exception but and phenomena of sorts which can be studied and also can be engaged in further social science research? Is it the responsibility of a researcher to bring in such concepts into the lived experiences of society that we look in, or um, what are the tools that we as young researchers may utilize when we are looking at such phenomena? Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Uh, so, when we speak of experience, then we are speaking of something which, at one level, is, like I said, common. When we speak of lived experience, there is something obvious and common in lived experience to the very fact of being alive and, in some senses, living a conscious life in the world. So, in that sense, what Heidegger called being in the world, which then has its own structures, its own unfoldings. So, everything is part of lived experience. So, to that extent, lived experience seems something which is so common that it is intriguing that we place so much weight on it when it comes to a specific kind of social science interest, social science stakes, value, the evaluation of certain kinds of experiences. That is why your question about the exceptional status of certain experiences becomes so important and interesting. Now, take an example from a book, a great book that was written by Michel Foucault called Madness and Civilization. What did he call that book? He called it an archaeology of the experience of something which has been suppressed, madness. But he did call it an archaeology of an experience. Now, you see, there is something very intriguing here, no? Something which is an experience should be something which we encounter. So if I'm experiencing something right now in talking to you, you're encountering me and I'm encountering you. So in that sense, lived experience is not simply individual and isolated, it is also social and interpersonal, intersubjective, and in kind of co-lived. Philosophically, it is in that sense part of co-being. But when someone says that we are talking of an archaeology of an experience, that we are talking of something which is to be provided to us in terms of something else, not this here and now moment of living reality, but something which is be to be seen in its traces. That's why in that time in the 60s and 70s in Europe, in Western thinking, there was so much obsessive but very, very important preoccupation with textuality, with discursivity, with something which retained its traces even after life had finished, the moment had gone. So a different understanding of time, temporality came into the picture. Not the temporality of the living present, but the temporality which is contained in apparently dead traces, dead signs, which are there in books, in the archive, in libraries. So Michel Foucault said, even there in those sites, there are experiences. But those experiences, surely they were also lived. A so-called mad person also lives his or her life in the very moment of so-called madness. But the trouble is, the moment you give it a certain social name, which is also a medical name, mad or madness, then immediately that experience has been emptied out of an egalitarian universal subject. So you see, there are some people who cannot belong to the other kinds of human experiences that we normally identify with human beings. For instance, everyday life, social customs, hello, hi, political rights like voting. I mentioned voting. Would a so-called mad person be allowed to vote? I mean, mad is just one example. You can have other kinds of categories. So Foucault said, look, something very strange is happening. Some categories, which are categories also of experience, madness is also a kind of experience, also make experience impossible for us to access, impossible for us to talk about. Why? Because then you can't answer the question, which you should be able to, in a logical sense, who experiences? So if you say mad, you say, no, the mad by definition is not rational. So you can't really trust the mad person's version of his or her experience. But that itself is the kind of experience of madness. So he says there is a kind of experience which is silenced. It's an archaeology of a silence. But that silence is not an empty, void silence. That silence contains that experience itself. Now, surely this kind of a structural paradox can be as much applied to other kinds of experiences, including in the question of caste, the experience of the exclusion that untouchability in its both ritual religious sense, but also in its social exclusionary sense, brings out. So of course there is experience, of course there's lived experience. So this is what, for instance, in the literary debates from Dalit literature, particularly the Dalit autobiography in Maharashtra and then in other languages, brings out that if there is a lived experience which is till now hitherto been unmentionable, has been excluded from what has been constituted as the normative space of an aesthetic literary experience. So literary experience of a life, of a person's life, someone who can tell his or her story, is not something which is accessible to the Dalit or to the untouchable, the erstwhile untouchable, because not only is the person excluded from social practices and social spaces, but that person is excluded from the value of enjoying a life. So, how can there be lived experience in the sense of something which can be symbolized, represented, put into text, if that very value of life is denied by society? So, in a sense, Dalit autobiography comes into that space which is neither literary nor social scientific. Because on both counts, there has been a denial of the value of social science discourse as well as literary quality, literary value. And Dalit autobiography in the 60s and 70s actually tries to force its way into a space which is neither a purely literary space nor a purely academic space. In that sense, the only word to use is that the Dalit autobiography becomes, in a sense, by default, a new political space, a public political space, a people's political space. So a social science researcher, to come back to your question, must, in a sense, be aware of the limits of one's given protocols of research to begin with. And then, having become aware of those limits, one must also find ways of both breaking those limits open. If that has to be done through a renewed, more sensitive ethics, then that sensitive ethics must be practiced. And if it has to be done under the pressure and inspiration of a new politics, then that must be experimented with. But most importantly, its real force, its real horizon must remain the larger public horizon, which the university must look towards, but must not try to subsume. That is my response.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, and I think anybody can. Any more questions? If you have, audience. Yes, Rahul Sahu. That's right. You can ask, Mr. Rahul.
Good evening, sir.
Hi, Rahul.
Sir, my question is, if we talk about international politics, so we have more option to do research. If we talk about caste, if we talk about caste subject, so we don't have enough matter to do research. If we talk about people go for the IR. If we talk about IR international, people go for the research in IR international session, but we have limited knowledge or limited scope in caste system. Uh, this is my question.
Yes,
So
yeah. Please finish your question, Rahul. Yeah. Carry on.
yes, this is my question, sir.
All right, Rahul. Thank you.
I am able to explain very good, but this is my question.
No problem, Rahul. No, I think the internationalist discussion is very important. Recently, I read a very exciting dialogue between Cornel West and Suraj Yengde on the parallelism and, in a sense, mutual inspiration in the race movement, the anti-race movement, and the anti-caste movement. And I think that is something which, on an international scale, already with Ambedkar and Du Bois and their conversation and so on and so forth, there were very interesting internationalist perspectives that one had seen in the anti-caste and anti-race movement, which in a sense also went beyond the limits of the anti-colonial movement. Because with the anti-colonial movement, the sovereignist reference remains too fixed. We still talk too much in terms of independence from colonizer, such that we seem to presume a very consistent, workable independence, sovereign independence of our societies, while our societies in themselves are plagued by tremendous internal conditions of colonization and inequality, which makes any such formal sovereignty merely formal and quite meaningless, actually. So that's why Ambedkar spoke of transfer of power rather than true independence at that time in 1947, in the social sense. But is the social movement to be entirely seen indigenously within the confines of a geographical unit or of that society? No, 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 no. There are already always internationalist currents and internationalist horizons and inspirations. So I have spoken about this in many places, and let me also mention this again. Even with Ambedkar, in the last part of his life, when he was so deeply immersed in his study of Buddhism, and he converted to his own version of, or his own invention of Buddhism, reinvention of Buddhism, he clearly was interested in what I have called a Buddhist internationalism. And some of our students, I know Rakesh in JNU in international politics is doing some work, very interesting work in this regard. There are some others who are wanting to enter the field of international research, international relations, through an Ambedkarite trajectory, which is not simply a step beyond nationalism or the national reference, national sovereignist reference, but something which actually comes from a true internationalism, which in a sense was pioneered by communism, no doubt, in the 20th century, when it spoke of a direct international brotherhood, a solidarity of the proletariat. So is it possible to speak of a direct international solidarity of the oppressed peoples, including the people who are engaged in the anti-race movement, in the Black Lives Matter movement, and the Dalit movement, and the anti-caste movement, and also the anti-patriarchal movement across the world? Now, of course, these are complicated questions because clearly, unlike the so-called proletariat, which at that time had a specific kind of constitution as a political subject as part of revolution across countries, these subjects do not possess any kind of unified global revolutionary sort of that kind of form of solidarity. But we must also remember that precisely because of the kind of again a kind of internationalism which also became a dogmatic internationalism, ultimately again determined by certain powerful states within the communist regime, whether that be China or Soviet Union, which in a sense took the entire internationalist force down. Today's more heterogeneous, more open-ended, but a new kind of internationalist possibility might actually look towards an international, thinking about international relations beyond the again the statist, the national statist reference. But this question is again a little challenging and difficult in the present times of the pandemic, because international relations has with great vehemence gone back to the national delimitation or the national reference, because all pandemic policy eventually is nation-centric today. Even though we do lip service, we give lip service to the so-called, axiom that globally no one is safe till everyone is safe. We just say it. Actually, we are all thinking hyper-nationally when we think of the pandemic. So that's a new crisis. So yeah, Rahul.
Yeah. So, Professor, actually, there is a question in chat box.
Sure. Please
Ankit
read it out.
Kawade.
I can't
Yeah.
see it. Read it out.
So, should I read or?
Please read it out. I can't see it.
Okay.
Yeah, please read it.
So it's a question by Ankit Kawade. He's asking, thank you for this lecture, Professor. Your criticism of the ethical imperative of Professor Guru's scholarship is somewhat similar to a charge usually leveled against Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism in particular, and his tremendous emphasis on religion is general, that Ambedkar's conversion is not adequate to challenge socioeconomic inequalities. How is your criticism of the anti-political nature of ethical prescriptions different from this charge, usually leveled against Ambedkar's Buddhism?
Thank you. Thank you. This is a very important question. Thank you, Ankit, for this. Uh, First of all, I'm hardly someone to make a criticism of Gopal Guru. On the contrary, I learned from him. Uh, it is through my own experience from within the situation of the university that I am able to articulate this doubt and discussion with regard to him. And I can only wait for his response to this. Now, through you, if I am to think that this criticism is similar to the one that people have made against Ambedkar and his conversion. Now, in a way, I also gave a somewhat answer, a kind of answer to this question in my response to the earlier question. You see, so this has nothing to do with to compare my comment with regard to Gopal Guru and how people think of Ambedkar's conversion. I do not think of Ambedkar's conversion like that at all. This is and I have written about it, I've spoken about it, and let me reiterate how I think about Ambedkar's conversion. To me, Ambedkar's conversion is through and through political. It is a political act of great collective experiment in converting to a new form of life, which is, of course, to make yourself accessible to a new kind of egalitarian, emancipatory experience. But only that new life will become possible when a new intervention takes place, which is a great politico-ethical intervention, but on a collective level. When it's a collective intervention and demands a new kind of organization, there Buddhism is organization. To me, Buddhism is not fundamentally, of course, his book is Buddha and his Dhamma, but Dhamma is not dogma. Dhamma is not even theory. Dhamma is not even the stories of Buddhism. Dhamma is fundamentally a condition for new organization. But new organization is not simply a functional organization. A new organization is also as much a vision of organizing life according to new forms of interaction, new forms of sociability. In that sense, something which is ethical, but not ethical in the individualist sense. Ethical in the sense of producing a new kind of collective disposition. A collective ethics is always more than ethics. In that sense, it is politics. Now, whether that vision to any measure has been successful, what has it led to, what kind of a new political sequence it has emerged into, which I have already mentioned, though it had nothing to do with Ambedkar's own writing on Buddhism at that time, but it did energize and move into a strong Dalit political sequence, which also had a great, a great force when it entered into state power, into its struggle for state power. Ambedkar's own life was spent in great frustration over not being able to enter the domain of state power sufficiently because of tremendous amount of upper caste sort of, kind of unity against a figure like Ambedkar. But in a post-Ambedkarite sequence, or an Ambedkarite sequence after Ambedkar's death, some of Ambedkar's own political force was realized in collective practice. Not too much, but a little bit was realized. All of that has also a Buddhist element to it. The Ambedkarite Buddhist element. And it is beyond ethics in the individualist sense. It all depends on what we mean by ethics. So when I speak of breaking through the ethical limits with its immense importance, so let me not discount the importance of the ethical moment, and yet I speak of breaking through it to a possibility of a new politics of association, as I call it, then much of that is inspired by Ambedkar's own conversion to Buddhism.
Yeah. So I think we have also now have to completed and wind up this talk. And
Ganesh, hello.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, this is Abhishek. Sorry, I have a query. I have a question rather.
yeah. You can
So
just,
can I
this is
ask?
the last.
Okay, okay,
Yeah. This is the last question actually.
okay.
Check.
Thank you,
Okay, go
thank
ahead.
you, all the organizers and Professor Soumyabrata Choudhury. This is Abhishek from CUG Gandhinagar. Again, as you mentioned that CUG is a relatively marginal spaces. So, and today we are talking about experiences. So, am I audible?
Yes, yes, Abhishek, you're audible.
Okay, okay.
Please go on.
So we are talking about theorizing experience. So I would like to share with you a recent experience, and I also would like to understand the whole phenomena. So what happened is a few days following the anniversary of Manusmriti Dahan, that is 25th December, this last December 2021. Okay, so 2 days later, I and other students of our CUG friends, we organized a talk, rather a discussion on Ambedkar's speech, Mahad speech. Okay, so on that day itself, we pasted the graphic picture of Manusmriti Dahan. Okay, so the experience is important because subsequently, the very next day, a group of students came and they tear up the posters, and they tear up another poster which was pasted, a Twitter poster on Smash Brahminical Patriarchy. Okay, so 2 days again later, they have tear up the preamble copies of Constitution. So now the politics is like we have filed complaint in the university administration, and it is going on matter. So I would like to understand how like this is simply the killing of our democratic space in the university. So how I would like to ask, so how to see this phenomena, and how we can set a politics which is which we should taken forward from what Ambedkar has given, what we have like how to utilize the space, open space for thought and engagement, not only for discussion but also a politics. So
Yeah,
uh, am I clear?
yeah, Abhishek, absolutely. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you for that. Thank you. So yes, this is exactly the question that I was trying to pose in terms of an Ambedkarite lesson for us today. And now I said this that with Ambedkar, the first moment was always something which was an open moment, a moment where anyone who is engaged in the process of the constitutional knowledge must completely confront without batting an eyelid, which is the confrontation with the real of anything, the real of the atrocity of caste, the real of the so-called sensitivity of the sensitive people who get hurt, the real of something which happens out of the blue, which we are not prepared for, the real of a text like Manusmriti. Now, if you take the example of Manusmriti itself, what is the real of a Manusmriti? How does one encounter the real of a Manusmriti? Is it by taking a look at the book called Manusmriti, about which one has some prior information? No, it is by actually reading it. So, what is really interesting and paradoxical about the Mahad December burning of the Manusmriti was that the Manusmriti was burnt because it was read. And after it was burnt, it was continued to be read by those who burnt it and who felt the need to burn it. Burning was not to read. It is a complete misunderstanding of the act of burning of a text, that it is not meant to be read. Burning is a kind of reading. Reading is to be able to confront the real of something obscene, something oppressive, something atrocious, including the Manusmriti. This was the first Ambedkarite lesson. And then everything else follows, up to politics. In our times, it seems to me, there is a great crisis at this very first stage. In our times, the real again comes to us violently, surprisingly, uh, makes us confused. All of these things happen. But we are not able to live up to the Ambedkarite lesson that confront it. And if comes in the shape of a text, read it. And then do whatever you have to do with it, with that real of confronting it. No. What we have is the opposite, the experience that you share with us. We have the opposite of that. Even before something is read, it is blocked. It is commanded out of reality. So there is a kind of insistence on commanding reality rather than confronting it. From where does this insistence come? Surely it comes from at least two sources. One is the source of an extreme sense of power, an extreme sense of ownership, of total rights to whatever that thing might be: nation, society, caste, religion, family, I don't know. A complete sense of right, that it is our thing and we will do whatever we want with it. But there surely is a second source, and probably the second source is far more important to keep in mind, and that is an extreme sense of danger, an extreme sense of vulnerability, that we are not in control at all, that we do not possess these exclusive rights at all, that our rights are actually all over the place, they are in grave threat. So this is what I meant initially by auto-heterogeneity. We want to be autonomous in the pure, immaculate sense of completely excluding anything other from us. But precisely because we are not that, we are continuously vulnerable to otherness, we then act out of the most crude and obvious instruments that we possess, which are, for instance, the instruments of law, state power, political power, and so on and so forth. So, tearing up of posters, immediate sort of blanking out, and this and that. So, I would think that the people who want to, tear up a poster saying Brahmanical patriarchy opposing, sort of burn the Manusmriti, are the ones who read the least, including from Manusmriti to Savarkar or whoever are the intellectuals of the counter-revolution. No one is willing to read, not to read for the scholarly sense, that a lot of people are doing, but read for the sake of confronting the real. Only from that moment onwards, politics can come. But that moment itself is blocked, or at least sought to be blocked. And the reason for that surely is a great sense of both, like I said, total control over society and a total sense of lack of control, a contrary sort of set of feelings. So in that sense, indeed, it's a crisis of experience. And if experience stands for being, in the fundamental sense of human existence, then what the people who did what they did with you and what they are doing all the time is a project of what I will call ontological murder. Yeah, I think that's enough.
Yeah, so again, I would like to thanks Professor Soumyabrata Choudhury to deliver such a thought-provoking talk, and it's also I am again thank you, Professor Choudhury, to share your valuable thought and giving us such a huge number of times, particularly. So I am also I would like to thanks all the audience and participants who are engaged with us. And now I would like to conclude or the end of this meeting. So thank you. Thank you, Professor Choudhury.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ganesh. Thank you, Vidyasagar, for your very kind invitation and for all the wonderful questions. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Then all you can leave now.